Good morning. I'm Teresa Andrada from GMA7. Secretary Balisacan, in your opening remarks, you mentioned that reconstruction and recovery are being stymied by policies like land acquisition, meron din on fund disbursements. I wonder, until now, are you still having these kinds of problems? And how is it being addressed? The NHA mentioned yung tatlong challenges, and obviously this parang is parallel already to what you mentioned. So how big of a factor are these challenges now to accomplish our goal? Lalo na sabi nyo, by 2016, merong certain number of houses, merong certain number of projects that has to be done. And sabi nyo, dapat by 2017, sana kahit papano, malaki-laki na rin yung natapos natin. Thank you.
Thank you. As you have heard from the various cluster presentations, the issues that we have confronted in the implementation have been largely tackled. We have been facilitating the coordination, the meetings, and helping resolve the issues, especially in relation to coordination between and among agencies. So we are quite more confident now that things are moving much faster than used to be. And with as Secretary Abad showed that the funding issue is less of the problem now, and the implementation among our agencies could now proceed faster than in our recent the past 2 years.
Yes, please. Approach the microphone.
I'm Joel Ginto from AFP. Sir, the target was to build houses for 205,000 families, and you mentioned that the target for the year end, for the end of 2016 is 92,500. When do we expect to complete the other 110,000 units, sir?
Okay. So just to hello. Okay. Just to clarify, by the end of 2015, we expect to finish the 21,455, and by June 2016, additional 42,000, and by December 2016, 28,533. This is to cover the funded projects, no? We are hoping that we will be provided fund to cover the balance of about 102,000. No, but majority of the 102,000 is included in our the budget for 2016. No, so if the budget is approved by 2016, we can start implementing this project, and in the timeline that I showed you, it's basically the construction and the procurement and the construction normally takes about a year to a year and a half, depending on the number of units. So we can expect majority of this to be completed by, or all of this to be completed by 2017, if funding will be provided, the entire funding will be approved in the 2016 budget.
Sir, do you have data how many families are still living in bunkhouses and transitional shelters, and how many people built their homes in the same place that they were destroyed?
I think the SWD can answer that.
Thank you. We have, as of October 14, 2015, a total of 2,315 transitional shelters were constructed, no? And this accommodates 1,576 families consisting of 7,302 families, individuals, I'm sorry. The 7,302 individuals are still staying in transition shelters in various sites.
Ma'am, ilan po yung inayos o kinumpo nilang yung mga bahay nilang nasira?
For emergency shelter, ito yung aming accomplishments, total of 1,028,329 families were targeted for emergency shelter, and that consists of totally and partially damaged units as long as they are in safe location. We have covered so far 987,545 or 96% of the target number of families.
To any of the panelists, the presentation mentioned that as of now there's just 900 families who were moved to permanent shelters, and this makes about 195,000 that are still vulnerable to a possible storm. What will happen to these people in case a storm as powerful as Yolanda hits the Philippines again?
Okay. The figure of 929 that were actually transferred to permanent housing facilities are basically, that's part of those staying in the temporary shelter or that was constructed by DSWD. No, I guess some of the families that are still staying in temporary shelter facilities provided by DSWD will soon be transferred in some of the completed units that we have. In fact, we were supposed to transfer some families yesterday, except that we needed to get certificate of occupancy from the LGU, from the transition shelter to the permanent shelter. But majority, I think, as I understand it, majority of those that will be living in the permanent facilities are either living living with their family, with their families, or only I think only a few are in the temporary housing facilities. But as I understand it, we have provided already enough permanent houses to cover those that are in the temporary housing facilities, so that we can now transfer them before the end of the year. So majority, I think, is already living with the relatives.
Sir, and just a general question maybe to Secretaries Balisacan and Abad. Sir, how much of what we set out to do in terms of the Yolanda rehabilitation has been accomplished these 2 years?
Well, in terms of the accomplishment overall, the ongoing and the largely completed, roughly about 51% of the projects have been completed, and almost on the completion stage. The others are still to be are at various stages of procurement, as mentioned during the presentation of the various clusters. The intention is to complete at least this 150 billion by the end of 2016, and by that time we should be reaching most of what has been planned. But remember that the reconstruction and rehabilitation is really up to 2017, particularly in the housing resettlement. And this is largely the government side. You still have a lot of recovery from the private sector side. Actually, as we presented during the early phase of the recovery reconstruction period, when we presented the reconstruction and recovery assistance for Yolanda, the bulk of the damage and losses is from the private sector, no? And that's where a lot of this recovery, continuing recovery, will have to come from. But from the point of view of the government, we should be able to complete this mostly by the end of the administration, and for the housing and other large infrastructure like the municipal buildings toward the end of 2017.
I'd just like to emphasize that, this is the strongest typhoon to ever hit Earth. So therefore, there is really no standards by which you can measure to what extent the administration has responded promptly or belatedly, to the consequences of this unprecedented calamity. But you, of course, saw earlier the comments of some of those who have experienced calamities, not even approximating this magnitude, like Katrina or the gentleman from Nigeria. Katrina, it's taking them 10 years and they're not done yet. The two most affected aspects of community life, which is housing and livelihood, are in fact being addressed with some definite time frame. Like, for example, the permanent housing program that was presented earlier by Secretary Cruz, which we hope to be able to complete by 2017. But the response here, and we have to stress this, and we have to give credit where credit is due, is the way really the communities themselves and the small businesses in these places have been able to respond to the damage wrought by Yolanda. And I think it is, and this is observed by many international aid agencies, the extent to which the cohesiveness of these communities and the bayanihan spirit that has characterized the way by which they manage not just to survive, but really come out of this, in fact, much better than when they started off. Look at the houses, compare the houses that they used to be staying in with the houses that they're staying in now. It's certainly much different. So I think while government is doing its best, and it's doing its best, I think, as observed, if you recall, during the World Economic Forum, there was a specific session on Yolanda response and the international perspective on this. And they were all saying that they are surprised by which, the pace by which, communities have been able to recover. And, government is not taking credit for this. The communities have really come forward to help themselves. And, what government is doing is injecting the support that the communities themselves cannot provide, like local and national infrastructure, settlements and livelihood. So I think you ought to look at the way not just government, but in general, our country has responded to this calamity, in the context of the experience of other countries which have not, in fact, experienced the same magnitude of calamity.
Okay. Yes, please. By the way, the NEDA and the DBM websites have updates on Yolanda. You can visit neda.gov.ph and dbm.gov.ph. Yes, please, sir.
Hello. Good morning, sir. I understand that the government needed 26 billion to build 92,000 units of housing for Yolanda areas. So for the remaining 102,000 units, how much would the government need in the 2016 budget to cover for those remaining units?
There is already in the budget that was approved on second reading before the session, before Congress adjourned, 26.5 billion pesos to complete the 205,000 plus units that of permanent housing that NHA has to build. So the budget has been secured for that, and following the time frame that Secretary Cruz presented, we should be able to finish them in a year or a year and a half, or by 2017.
Sir, only 26 billion for 2016? Because for the 92,000 units, you needed 26 billion. But another 26 billion can build 102,000 units? Is that correct?
Well, I would refer you to
Or
There's
higher?
I
Higher
have-
amount?
Secretary
Yeah.
Cruz can respond.
Yeah, Sec Butch, I think what is provided in the NEP for 2016 is about 26 billion, but in between now and end of the year, there's about 7.3 billion additional that we are looking forward to receiving from DBM from the dividends. So that will take care of the balance. So it's 26.
Plus 7.
Sorry, 26.9 plus 7.3 plus the 2025 for 25 billion in the budget for 2016. That will complete the 205,128 funding for the 205,128 units that we require.
Okay, thank you.
That 7.3 billion already has funding courtesy of the excess revenues coming from GOCC dividends this
From
year.
savings.
No. It's dividends from GOCC. Yeah.
Okay. Sir, what policy issues do we still need to do to address the perceived delays in these rehabilitation projects? Are there any laws that should be amended to speed up the recovery process?
The National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Act is for review this year, and Congress is already deliberating on that. We hope to have that passed, and that review will take into account the lessons that we have learned and the policies we need to change, the arrangements for, especially in the area of coordination between national and local governments and among agencies and so on and so forth. No? And that should speed up our capacity to respond to disasters. No? I think Yusek Palma nandito, he could elaborate, he could elaborate on that. Second error na yan.
Okay, we have time for the last two questions. I'm sorry. Okay, sorry.
Follow through.
Yes.
Yeah, I think you have noticed in the briefings kanina that one of the major hindrances in pursuing a faster building of, for example, the housing units, a lot of other regulations, and even to include laws. One case, for example, is the conversion of land. There are a lot of conflicting laws, or maybe hindrances, if you may call, in the implementation of our national disaster risk reduction system that can hopefully, if they are put aside, can help us expedite in doing a lot of these things. One case, for example, is as soon as we do some procurements, we are covered by Republic Act 9184, which is the Procurement Act. And you are using a law on procurement on ordinary times in an emergency situation. So these are some of the things, marami pa po eh. But in the conduct of our review, because under Republic Act 10121, 5 years after the formulation of that law, or the enactment of that law, which is 2010, the law 10121 will have to be reviewed. That's why tinawag na sunset review, and that is supposed to be conducted this year. We have already prepared a draft amendments for that law, and it is ready for submission to Congress. We're just going to make a final vetting with the other government agencies to include the local stakeholders. That has gone through a lot of consultations for the past so many months, and we are ready to present this to Congress, hoping to be able to address, among others, precisely what Manny was asking: what are these regulations, laws that can more or less be rectified, if you may, or amended in the law para mapabilis pa na po natin yan.
Thank you, Sec Pama.
Well, as chair of the GPPB, the Government Procurement Policy Board, we are really looking at designing a procurement policy that is applicable during times of calamity, particularly with respect to relief operations, because relief requires, or relief and rescue operations, because you really don't have time for the traditional or the usual procurement processes that need compliance. So we are looking at that regime and adopt an applicable procurement policy.
Jing Castañeda, ABS-CBN. For Secretary Abad, sir, may we just get your reaction regarding report released by COA that a large part of the Yolanda funds or the donations have not been released. I think 20% or 30%, only around 30%, have been released, and that a huge chunk is still deposited in the banks.
Well, I don't know, what date that report was made, because the most difficult project to implement among all these projects is really the housing program, and you could see the development and some of the challenges they face in implementing permanent settlements for those that need to be moved from their present location. So you can appreciate more or less, what the government is doing and is facing just by looking at the developments in the housing program. So we would like to get more details with respect to that report, because we. Well, maybe we can look at the implementing agencies, hear from them, and give you an answer.
Okay.
Let me start. DSWD is one of the agencies cited by COA, but let me emphasize that the time frame of the COA audit was 2014. And that was the time when DSWD and the entire government had been very heavy into relief operations. As of now, I'd like to report that DSWD, out of the one cited earlier by Secretary Abad, out of the commitments, the government received only 2 billion, and DSWD received more than 1 billion of that. No? So to be exact, 1.3 billion pesos had been received by DSWD as donation. We have accounted so far actual disbursement of 1.2 billion, and there's a remaining amount of 42 million, and this had been already allocated, when in fact this had been obligated. Part of the 42 million was the 10 million we support to construct or to set up water tanks in the Ridgeview permanent shelter units in Villa Sofia and Diana, to help the displaced families transferred to the permanent resettlement sites. Others are along cash for work, which had already been implemented. We also have amount for a donation coming from the local agency. This is the Department of Tourism to support regeneration, revival, or reactivation of tourism-related or tourism-oriented projects through the DSWD amounting to 5M, and this had been allocated for Palawan, Region 4B, for tourism support livelihood projects.
And the last question from Ben.
For Secretaries Balisacan then about...
Ay, sorry.
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 Jing, if you're also referring to the COA report on OCD.
OCD,
Yeah. The report, that was the annual audit report of COA on OCD, the cutoff date of which is December 2014. Specifically, I think what COA was referring to there was our quick response fund. And I'd like to make it clear to our friends in the media, there's no such thing as quick relief fund. It's quick response fund. Kasi malaking bagay po yung dalawang word na yan eh. Anyway, in that report, COA reported that we had 923 million unutilized QRF funds, and that's correct. Again, the emphasis is that was a report ending 2014. 10 months hence, which is now, all those, the totality of the amount has already been utilized or obligated. I'm sorry. I have a very good coach from the secretary. So the whole amount of 923,000 as of this date has already been obligated. Some of them are in the procurement of non-food items, which are now in the process of the bidding process and procurement. So that report is correct. That 923,000 is now, as of this date, totally obligated. A portion of that was returned to the Bureau of Treasury, if I'm not mistaken, about 9 million plus, for the reason that those were funds, continuing funds from 2013, where in 2015 hindi na po magamit, so that was returned. But the whole, practically the whole sum is already covered in that report.
Ma'am, follow-up lang po. With Secretary Abad and Secretary Balisacan, we just would like to get, of course, as Secretary Abad mentioned, there are no standards by which we can measure the performance up against. But given your own targets, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate the government's performance in the 2 years after Typhoon Yolanda, 10 being the highest?
8.5.
We will leave that to you guys and to the international observers.
Self-assessment, sir.
But, you saw the presentations and they should speak for themselves. Thank you.
Okay, one final question.
Hi, sirs. Ben De Vera of Philippine Daily Inquirer. It was mentioned earlier based on the FATE website that only less than a fourth of the foreign aid pledges have already come in, and has the government already asked these quote-unquote donors, whatever happened, why are they not pushing through? Why are these not materializing? Are they afraid to, give this money to government, or what are the reasons? And also, given that most of what has been received so far went to the NGOs and multilateral agencies, is there also any way to measure how much progress or how much contributions they have, their projects have contributed to the entire national effort to rehabilitate the Yolanda hit communities?
Well, many of this, if you recall, this happened towards the end of 2013. So, if they follow the calendar year budgeting, their budget for 2014 would have already been also put together. So, their best bet is 2015. And many of them had to go through their respective parliaments to secure authorization to spend for these pledges. So,
But sir, we're already halfway, past halfway 2015.
yeah, well, as you could see, we have been busy with not just with Yolanda but now Lando, and we have requested the DFA, because the DFA is the appropriate agency who can remind this is still substantial amount of money that hopefully could still be remitted to the Philippines. And so we certainly, and we have been, making representations, not directly with them, but through the DFA to find out, how the remittances can proceed much faster, because these are pledges.
How about, sir, sa participation naman of the NGOs and the multilaterals in terms of their initiatives outside whatever's being done by government now?
The bulk of that pledges, no, the commitments made by either bilateral governments or bilateral organizations or country partners, no, are usually channeled to organizations, multilateral organizations like the UN. No? I think for Canada, for example, through the UNICEF. For some of the, I think also Canada, no, they channel it through International Red Cross, and for at least for those that are channeled to multilateral organizations, we could ask perhaps for a report, no, on how the funds that were received for Yolanda where you are utilized in the field.
Have you not received any report yet from them? Have you asked or received any reports from?
Well, from day one, I have been pushing for that kind of coordination. That's why I said earlier that coordination, because our experience was that there is that. We ought to work harder on that, even at that level of coordination between our development partners and us. Sometimes, even in a situation where there's a functioning government, some of these agencies fly directly to those areas, and that has to change, because that would not achieve, or that would not effectively utilize the resources.